What's up, Relentless people? It's now week whatever of however long we've been doing this, but I'm really excited to talk to you guys about something I think is really cool tonight. Actually going to be talking about missions and the importance of speed to light. I'm sure Eliza just got really excited as soon as I said the word missions, for obvious reasons. But I want to tell you guys a little story. There really is no title for this video tonight, so I'll probably come up with one in post-production. You know, that sounds really cool and is really compelling, but I don't have one right now, so that's the beauty of recording stuff. But you can cheat a little bit on stuff like that. But I want to tell you guys a story, but before I do that, I'm going to open up with a Bible reference from Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 2, and this is what it says. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Considered him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. I want to talk to you guys about a missionary who lived a really long time ago. And he was actually born in the 1880s, which is like 140 years ago, which sounds super old now that I'm talking about that. And it's a dude by the name of Victor Plymire. Now, Victor Plymire grew up and gave his heart to Jesus at the age of 15, around the same age as many of you guys. And worked for a while in the regular world, you know, but always felt like he was supposed to go into full-time ministry, which he did. And he pastored a couple churches in Pennsylvania. But then, you know, around, I believe around the age of 30, he really felt like he was supposed to go into full-time missions overseas. And so he applied to go into missions. And back then, you didn't really get to go where you wanted. The way the missions worked was wherever you were needed, that's kind of where you got sent. So if you were like, man, I really hope I get sent to the Bahamas, chances were you were getting sent to like the Amazon or Tibet or somewhere crazy where you could die. And that's what happened to Victor. He didn't really care where he was going, he just wanted to go. And so he applied to become a full-time missionary, and he was sent to northern China. Now, travel back then wasn't like it was now, so he actually had to travel from Pennsylvania to the California coast. He then had to get on a boat and cross the Pacific, which back then in the 1900s was a really long journey. It took about a week to cross the entire ocean there, or maybe a little longer. And then he arrived in China, and then he had to travel to the interior of the country, you know, not by car or anything. We're talking like, you know, by carriage or horse or yak or whatever they had. And then from the interior of China, he traveled to the northern province of China, close to Tibet, where he was to be stationed. Now, it was in this area that Victor met his wife, who was also another missionary named Grace, and they fell in love, and they were engaged for like 5 years, which I think is unnecessarily long, but, you know, more power to Victor and Grace. They got married, and that was awesome. And then they came back to the United States because they had to raise money so they could go back, and while they were on furlough, they had a son. And when their son was about a year old, they traveled back to China. They had the money they needed, and they were all excited and you know, really hopeful and whatever. And so they made their really long journey across country, across the Pacific Ocean, across China, and north to the, you know, to the Tibetan border, and they started their mission. Well, while they were there, they worked for, I believe it was a couple years, and not a single person gave their heart to Jesus. And Victor and his wife would go in every village and every city that they went to, and in every trade route that they traveled, they would hand out tracts and they would preach the gospel. And all the tracts were written in the language of the locals, so they could easily read them, you know, and they had learned the language and the dialects of that area, so they didn't need translators, but they worked tirelessly preaching the gospel for years. Not a single person gave their heart to Jesus. Well, finally, a couple years into their ministry, one person, young person, was their first convert. And after that happened, they planted a little church in a town called Tanjar. I forget the name of it now is different. It's a very it's like Huang Yang or something crazy like that. I know I just butchered that Chinese name. Sorry to anybody who's Chinese who's watching this, but it's not easy for me. And they planted a small church there, and the church began to grow. Well, then a smallpox epidemic raged through China, and a lot of the U.S. workers and missionaries who were there were all implored to come home because China didn't have the infrastructure or the medicine to combat that epidemic. Well, Victor and his wife both decided they needed to stay, with so many missionaries leaving that they were afraid there would be really no one left to preach the gospel to the people of China and Tibet, so they stayed. And after doing so, Victor's wife Grace and his son David both contracted smallpox, and Victor tried to nurse them back to health and prayed and really believed that God would heal them, and he thought that this would be the thing that God would use to help the church they had planted explode. And, well, that's not exactly what happened. Unfortunately, Victor's wife, Grace, and his son David both died. And obviously that was not what Victor was hoping for, but undeterred about the mission that God had given him, when they both passed away, a day apart from each other, Victor constructed a small coffin for his then 5-year-old son, and the residents of the town that they were in, who had grown to really greatly respect this man, provided the coffin for his wife. Now, at the time, it was illegal for any non-citizen or resident of China and Tibet to really own property, so the church that they were operating was just out of the house that he and his wife were renting, and he wanted to find a place where he could bury his wife and son. But to do so, he had to own property. And he went around this village looking for property, and he finally found a farmer who had what he believed was a useless plot of land on a really, it was a large hilltop, but kind of like the foothills of one of the larger mountains in the area, that it just wasn't good for farming, and it wasn't good for construction back then. They didn't really have the methods of the buildings that they could really construct properly on that land, because it was very hilly and very kind of a steep grade. And so this farmer sold it to him for cheap because the land was useless to him. Otherwise, he probably wouldn't have sold it. And so then Victor buried his wife and son there on that spot. And when the farmer gave him the deed to the land, the farmer had written the deed in the name of the church and not Victor's name. But it didn't really matter, because as long as Victor had the deed, it was his land, and no one could build on it, and no one could, mess with the gravesite of his wife and son. Well, eventually he had to come back to America to raise money again, and he did so this time, now a widower, and now, with the child that had passed away. But it wasn't all sadness for Victor, because he met another lady who was going to be a missionary, and they fell in love, and they got married, and they had kids. And then they went back to northern China, and back to the same church that he had planted, and they continued to do that. Well, something then happened that Victor was hoping wouldn't happen, and the Communist Revolution took place in China, and all non-Chinese nationals had to flee the country. And it was at this point in time that Victor realized that he would never get to go back to this place ever again. This place that had become his home. A place that he desperately loved and so badly wanted to stay. So when they came back on their last furlough to raise money to hopefully go back, at that point China had closed their borders to any religious individuals, so Victor and his wife and their new son could never go back. And so at that point, he began to pastor churches in America, and he eventually moved to Springfield, and he worked for, the AG home office or national office there, and he did so until he died at the age of 75 in 1956. And while that may sound like a bummer, there's a really cool part of this story that continues far beyond the passing of Victor. You see, his son with his second wife eventually ended up going back to Hong Kong, which was under British control, and was working at a radio station there. And he would just, do a daily radio show, and the radio show would broadcast into a lot of China. And one day he was contacted by a person who had gotten saved in Victor's church, his father's church, many years before. Now, the Chinese government had suppressed all the churches, and it had seized all their land and taken all their things. But there was a legal loophole stating that if anybody could show proof of land ownership, the Chinese government had to hand that land back to those people, even if it was a religious organization, which they technically weren't allowing at the time. So this person who heard this radio DJ and eventually found out his name, last name was Plymire, contacted him hoping that he was somehow related to his former pastor, Victor. And he asked this individual, if you are Victor's son, and I believe you are, do you have anywhere in your father's records proof that he had ever owned land anywhere here in northern China or Tibet? And so Victor's son looked through all his dad's things, and because he knew that the church did own property at one point, but he could never find it. The only thing that he could find was the deed to the burial plot that he had bought from this farmer, and where his first wife and son were buried. But the deed was never written out in the name of his father. It was written out to the name of the church. And so Victor's second son sent this deed to this individual, who then brought it before the local Chinese Politburo in this town and showed it to them, showing that the church did indeed own a plot of land on the outside of town, land that then was, land that could now be developed and that could now be built on. But it was a piece of land that nobody had touched because it was a burial ground. And this city and town had really began to develop around this area, except for this plot of land that Victor owned that used to be useless farmland. And so it was at that point that the church, which had been under, communist, they'd been in hiding from communism for decades, was able to reestablish itself and build a building and own property, which they did, and start resuming services again, because they legally own this land whether the government liked it or not. It's a miracle that the government never took it away. That church is still there today. And it's a very large church, and it's growing, and a lot of really cool things are happening there. Now, the Chinese government is cracking down on churches once again now, but I can imagine that if this church could survive decades under old communism in secret, I'm pretty sure they're going to be able to survive in secret now today if they have to. The really amazing part about this story is that the plans that we have, that we think make sense on paper, are usually not the plans that God has for us. And I look at missionaries like Victor Plymire and his story, and I really marvel at everything that this person, his first wife and his second wife, were able to do, because this is before anything like BGMC existed. This is before anything like Speed the Light existed. These individuals had to raise all the money that they needed for everything that they had, for all their travel expenses, for all of the, for their clothing, for their food, for their supplies, for their materials. They had to go out and raise all this money on their own, just by visiting churches or just by contacting people that they knew. BGMC and Speed the Light now just gift missionaries things that they need, like cars and sound systems and materials and Bibles and technology, and the list of the things that BGMC and Speed the Light buy are really just, it numbers in the hundreds, and it's incredibly useful and necessary things these missionaries need. Now, back in the day, Victor didn't have a car. He didn't really have that in the mission field to him. But when he would plan missionary trips, he would buy or rent 40 mountain yaks, and they would go on all these trade routes where there were thieves and there were bandits and there were criminals. And he would traverse, through northern China into Tibet and then into India preaching the gospel. He had to raise all that money on his own. There was no Speed the Light to provide any of those things for him. And the reason why I share Victor's story with you is Victor was one of the first Assemblies of God missionaries to ever go out into the mission field. When the Assemblies of God was founded in 1920, when Victor was almost 40 years old, he became one of the first Assemblies of God missionaries to go into northern China, to go overseas. And he did all this raising money without help from a lot of the things that our missionaries need help with today. And I think about the missionaries we send out now, and a very good friend of mine and his wife are just going to be there and going to be now very soon here starting their itineration to go into the mission field so they can go into Africa and be missionaries there. And I know Speed the Light is going to buy them a vehicle, and I know BGMC is going to provide them with materials and a lot of things, and this is stuff that they're just never going to have to worry about raising money for. That our original missionaries back in the day, the only thing that the church provided them with was money for their caskets, just in case they were martyred over there and they had to be sent back home. Speed the Light is incredibly important to our mission efforts today. It relieves our missionaries from having to raise large chunks of money to buy transportation and the things that they need. and we just provide that for them. Speed the Light provides training materials for pastors so that entire groups of pastors can go to a digital Bible college and receive their degree and receive their credentialing in a short period of time so they can go out and begin to plant churches in these places that missionaries are at. And I want to read for you guys another verse, probably from one of the greatest missionaries ever. And this would have been some of the last words he spoke to his protege, to the person that he was mentoring, the person that would come after him and continue a lot of his work. And that's something that the Apostle Paul wrote to his mentee Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 8, verses 6 through 8. And Paul says to him, "For I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time for my departure is near. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing." Now, I know a lot of us are not going to get to go into the full-time mission field. God has plans for all of us. But missionaries are so incredibly important. And even though a lot of us are not going to be able to go and serve in the mission field full-time, like Victor and his family did, we can still partner with these people and go with them in a way that is effective and that connects us to their ministry and connects us to all the souls that they reach for Christ. I know this year has been really wild. In the month of February, we got really excited and we set Speed the Light goals for ourselves as individuals and for our youth group as a whole. And then about a month later, this pandemic happened, and it totally changed our lives, and it totally changed how this world, was working and how it was doing. And suddenly all of you are homeschoolers, and you can now all make that joke, well, I've got tons of issues because I was homeschooled, because all of you were now. So I guess now every single teenager on the planet has an excuse to be a knucklehead. But even though our lives have changed, there's a lot of things that we've kind of forgotten about in a negative way. And Speed the Light, I think, and missions is one of those things. And because we're not getting together every week, and we don't have an offering, or maybe we're not talking about missions, and you guys aren't being visually reminded of how important that is, I want you guys to really think about and not forget the goals that you set. Now, you might think, well, it's impossible for me to meet the Speed the Light goal now because I couldn't have been working, or I couldn't have done this, or I wanted to do this fundraiser, and now I've lost almost, a third of the year, and now I don't think I can reach that goal. And I just want to challenge you and say, do you think God didn't know this pandemic was coming when he gave you that number in February? Because he did. And if your goal was $100 or $500 or $1,000, or even if it was only $50, if that's the number that God gave you, then pandemic or no pandemic, that goal is possible to achieve. And so I want to challenge every single one of you tonight, don't forget about what God laid on your heart for missions this year. Don't let this pandemic become an excuse, because God knew this was going to happen when he put that in your heart. And if God knew that this was going to happen, God knew about the trials and the tribulations we were going to face this year when he gave you that goal, then it is still more than possible for that goal to be met. So don't think that goal is no longer attainable, because it is. I love you guys. It was so awesome seeing some of you at church on Sunday. I know not all of you can be there because of health reasons and safety reasons, so don't feel like you have to rush back, or if your parents aren't comfortable coming back, please don't annoy them and be like, we need to go to church, because if you freak them out, then that's not good. Don't annoy them to death. That's frustrating. But you know what? When you do get to come back, and when I do get to see you on a Sunday, I'm really excited for that. I can't wait until we can at some point, resume our regular stuff we did on Wednesday night. But until that day, these digital devos, they're enough. Because this was all part, while this might not have been a part of our plans, this is what God is using to touch our hearts and to dramatically affect our lives and affect the lives of those around us. So That's it. That's all I have for you guys tonight. Don't forget about Speed the Light. Keep saving money. Keep trying to find ways to raise money. Keep holding on to it. Don't spend it on weird stuff like shoes or clothes or food, even though McDonald's can be delicious, especially breakfast. But don't forget about missions and how important it is. We can all be connected to a missionary like Victor, whose work, even though he passed away 70 years ago, is still powerfully and impactfully changing the lives of many people across northern China. So I love you guys. I'll see you soon.